from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
Open your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1. Faith often grows when God says no. Or perhaps another way to consider it is, if we're in one of those places where it just seems like God is in agreement with our desires and our wishes and things are just going great, we often catch ourselves just sort of going with the flow, all is well. But one could make the argument that when God says no, or maybe said another way, the chances of my will being the same as God's will are probably not very often, right? That's probably slim. I won't say none, but certainly slim. And so how we handle when God says no? Will we still trust Him? Is our faith still that God loves us and that He has what's best in mind for us? Are we tempted to help God out? Are we tempted to conclude that perhaps God doesn't care, or maybe God isn't able, or He's just too busy for someone as small as me? Those are all kinds of opportunities where we're challenged when God says no. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we'll read an example where someone is told no by God for a long time. A request that seems common, that seems reasonable, and yet God says no. So in the very first chapter of 1 Samuel, we meet a man in the opening verses, Elkanah, and he has two wives in verse 2, and one of those wives is named Hannah, and we're told that she has no children. In verse 3, now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And there were priests there. And then in verse 4, when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. The Lord had closed her womb. So this is God's doing. This is what is God's choice and will for Hannah. Now we understand, since God is sovereign, that He's in charge of everything. There is no atom nor molecule in this universe that can do anything without God's permission. So everything that happens is because God allows it. Even in the story of Job, when Satan is trying to incite Job against God, Satan can't do anything without God's permission. Now that does bring up the challenge, why would God allow some things? And that's part of this no equation. Why does God allow some things to happen? God does not do evil, but He does allow evil to exist. He could wipe out Satan in an instant. After all, if Satan's going to be destroyed in the smoke of the fires of hell forever, wouldn't it be nice if He'd just do that now? But by the will of God and the purpose of God, God allows that to be for the time being. So, again, this is about our faith or about trust when God says no. Hannah is unable to have children to this point, and we read in the text, because God had closed her womb. Verse 7, it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, that she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. So we noticed in verse 5 that the Lord had closed her womb. Verse 6, her rival, the other wife, her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. And then her husband's going to try to be helpful, but he's going to say, aren't I as good as 7 sons to you? Well, no and yes, or yes and no, however you want to answer that question. But isn't it interesting that her heart's desire is to have a child, and God has said no to her? And every time she's going to the house of the Lord in order to worship, she's provoked, she's irritated, she's hurt so that she weeps. So this thing stays raw right in the middle of her worship. It's not like she's even had the opportunity, just kind of push that aside, let me kind of put that out of mind, I'm going to go worship. She's trying to worship, and somebody's making sure that it's right there and something she has to deal with. Well, so in verse 9, so after eating and drinking in Shiloh, she goes to the house of the Lord. She sits at the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. Verse 10, she, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Let me just remind you that, remember, weep is not the same thing as cry. Weep is to lose it. Weeping is an out-of-control emotion. It's past just the sniffles or dab the eye with a tissue. This is hurting. This is raw. And not only is she losing it, this emotion's just pouring out of her, but she's weeping bitterly. So there is with that this pain, this sharpness. Bitterness is the language of regret, of unresolved hurt, of this difficulty that won't go away, this thing that she's been provoked about each and every year. So then she makes a vow, and she promises that the Lord would grant her prayer. She would dedicate that child to the Lord. She is so intense in her prayer that Eli, the priest, in the very next, in verse 12, thinks that she's drunk, right? Because you've got all this emotion, you're going to have movement, and then you've got all this praying, but she's not praying out loud, so she's moving her lips, and that means her head and her expression. She's really expressing a lot, silently, at least as far as speech goes. So Eli wonders, is she just drunk and this is wrong, and why would you come to the Lord in such a state? And then they'll have that conversation that we'll look at in just a moment. So far, what we're noting is that Hannah is asking God for a child. Like everybody else, right? The vast majority of people have children. So she's not asking for anything crazy, anything unusual. And God is saying no. And she is now asking God, and has been with this intensity, and God is still saying no. What we're seeing is that God is in charge of this answer. Flip back to the book of Genesis. There's actually, I don't know if I'd call this a theme, but this is interesting that we see this a number of times. When you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 11, we run into this for the first time with Abraham and Sarah. He's still called Abram, she's still called Sarai, because those names will change as it has to do with them bearing children. But we're told in Genesis chapter 11, verse 30, that Sarai was barren, that she had no child. The implication, and what will be borne out throughout the reading, is that she is unable to have children. And with just a little bit of reflection, we can consider how in the ancient times this was so important. This was absolutely the woman's role in the marriage is to provide children. That was her identifying characteristic, and it still is in the sense that only women can bear children. But so much in the ancient civilization, so much of that was even her value, not just her identity as the one who would bear children, but that's her job, that's her value. Right? I'm talking about ancient civilizations. Obviously, this isn't God's view, because God, by his choice, isn't allowing her to have children. Not because, and this is a key thought, not because she's not important. So the ancient folks, and we make all kinds of ties and connections with value and priority that God doesn't make. Okay? But this is a situation. She's not able to have children. In chapter 12, in verse 11, have you ever thought about how, since she's not able to have children, and in her world and among her peers, she would be considered a failure as a woman, right? Because she's not able to have children, not able to grant her husband children. So there's no descendants, there's no lineage, there's no inheritance, none of that. So verse 11, when they go down to Egypt because of the famine, it says, it came about that when Abram came near to Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Okay, and he's talking about her appearance, her form and appearance and all that. Fine. But, I never really thought about until recently that these words may have been cutting, right? Because he's describing her as beautiful, right? Because of the features of her face and her form and all that. Generally speaking, what often happens is that bearing children tends to change a woman's form. That's just sort of how it normally goes. And there are cases where women then lament that they no longer have a body in the same shape as they did before children, and they can feel bad about that or wonder if they're still beautiful and all that. It's interesting that Abram calls her beautiful, but I wonder how she heard that. Does she feel beautiful because she's not been able to have children? Conversely, when women have been able to have children, can they see what amazing gift and what a beautiful thing that is, or are they bothered by, well, now they might look a little different? So it's just interesting on which side of the experience, I guess, that Sarah is, and the definition in her mind and in Abram's mind about beauty. Turn to chapter 15 in Genesis. God has told him, we should have read it while we were in chapter 12, verse 2, that I will make you a great nation, I'll bless you, make your name great. Well, to make him a great nation is about descendants, which of course they have no children, and Sarah's not been able to have children, so that's a problem. Chapter 15, that's what Abram brings up in verse 2, is how's this work since I'm childless? I guess the heir will be the servant in my household. And God says, no, but from your body, verse 4, you're going to have children. And then in verse 5, come out and look at the stars. You're going to have more descendants than the stars in the heavens, an uncountable amount. Again, I've always followed this through Abram, and he has his struggles and challenges in terms of faith and trusting God. But you know what's an interesting perspective is when Abram's told this, and he's like, well, I've not been able to have children. Why is that? Because he's married to who? Sarah. Whose fault is that? Now, we know nowadays it could be either one or both, right? But in those days, it was always a woman's fault, as far as whatever the challenge might be. So when Abram says, I guess it'll be a servant, no, it'll be from your body. Have you ever thought about the pressure that Sarah might have felt? Okay, I have no children. My husband's supposed to have descendants, and nothing's happening. Now, Abraham has told, you're going to have more descendants than the stars of the sea. Stars of the heaven. I wonder how Sarah heard that. Like, wow, I mean, isn't that a lot of pressure? How are they going to have more descendants if it's not going to be through a legal process through a servant? So, as equally as much, maybe in some ways more, in the same way that Abram is challenged, like, I'm going to have to trust that God's going to be able to pull this off, so does Sarah. So now, maybe that gives us a slightly different view of what goes wrong in chapter 16. So far, God has said no to them having children, right? But at the same time, he's saying you're going to have a lot of descendants. This is where faith grows, because God's no is actually a slow, a not right now, not yet, in time, at the right time. No, you absolutely must know your inheritance is not going to be through your servant. It's going to be from your body. It would have been kind of nice if God had said in chapter 15, through you and Sarah's body. But he doesn't, which means it's as much a faith journey for Sarah as it is for Abraham. So how would you like to be Sarah hearing, nope, it's not going to be a legal process through a servant. It's going to be through your husband's body. And obviously you're not able to do anything. So can you see where she might connect the dots in chapter 16? Well, I guess here's my servant. I guess you can have children with her because it's still from your body. And I'm just, I'm over here being useless. That gives us perhaps a little bit of insight into the pain in her life and in her heart, and why it would be so painful when, sure enough, Hagar bears a son, not just gets a child, but also a son. Oh, here we go. And then the struggles between the two women. How that would have cut Sarah. She's having to live with this on a daily basis. Flip over to chapter 17, verse 4. Again, God is talking to him about the covenant that he has with Abram. Abram falls on his face in verse 3. God says, verse 4, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall you be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Let me read the last part of verse 5 again. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Abraham doesn't have any children. He thought maybe his servant Eliezer. No, that's a flat no. Okay, well, then I guess I'll have children with another woman. No, that's not going to be it either. So, not even I will make you, but I have made you a father of many nations. Like how? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't see any kids running around here. This is about trusting God. Why is God doing this? Because he's growing Abraham and Sarah's faith. Why is God telling them no? So they can grow. The slow is what leads, in this case, to the grow. Wasn't a quick yes, a very long yes. One that requires great patience. I have made you a father. Now he does tell him, but after that statement in chapter 17, verse 4 and 5, he goes on to talk to him about his descendants and how they're going to go to Canaan and so on. And then verse 15, then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. And Abraham falls on his face and just laughs in his heart from just joy. Will a child be born to a man 100 years old, and will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? She's well past the age for bearing children. And so the point I'm trying to make, or at least trying to maybe help us think about a little bit, there is a sense where God's promises have a sharp edge to them, that they're cutting. Because to say, I have made you a father of many nations, he doesn't get to that until verse 15, that she's about Sarah, and they still don't have any children. And they've already had the no to Eliezer, and they've already had the fiasco with Ishmael through Hagar. So this is a touchy subject, a painful one, I would surmise. Certainly one that's been confusing for them, not as they would have expected. But you see how God is telling them something as if it is, chapter 17, verse 5, I have made you a father of many nations, when they have no evidence. In the very next chapter, in chapter 18, again, God's messenger is going to tell Abraham in Sarah's hearing this time that she herself is going to have a child. And she just kind of has a different laugh than Abraham does. One not of joy, but of doubt, or she's having more trouble with it. But think about her perspective. Think about how long she's lived with that pressure that Abraham's going to have all these descendants, and she's not doing her part. That's at least one way that could be perceived. In chapter 18, you'll also notice, well, in chapter 18, we notice that comment as they make the promise to Sarah, and then she laughs. She's going to be the mother of nations. The same thing, turn to Genesis chapter 25. As I said, I don't know if I'd call it a theme, but it's certainly an interesting issue. In the very first three generations, from Abraham, then they have a son Isaac, he and Sarah, and then we're not even talking about it. And then God says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering, which makes no sense if you've waited all this time for a promised child, and now I'm supposed to burn him up on an altar? That's why later in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham sacrifices him by faith. And Paul talks about that he knows that God could even, as the Hebrew writer does, could even raise someone from the dead. That he's trusting God when things just aren't making sense. Not from Abraham's perspective. And I think we could certainly give him some understanding for the limitation of that. So he and Sarah finally have the promised son Isaac. And then Isaac's going to marry a young lady named Rebekah. And then in Genesis chapter 25, verse 21, we run into this interesting statement. Verse 21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Isaac was born way late in his parents' life, well after the time of childbearing, after all of that agony and all of that struggle, and then when he gets married, they're not able to have children. We're still a few stars short of uncountable when we're talking about Isaac. We're talking about numero uno, right? I mean, one. We got one. That's a long ways from uncountable. And they're not able to have children. But then he prays, and then Rebekah's blessed that God hears the prayer. And then look, if you would, in Genesis chapter 29. So they do have two children. Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob grows up, and then he gets married. He meets Rachel and marries her. And Of course, there's some shenanigans, to say the least, that go on there, and he ends up with two wives. He ends up with Leah first and then Rachel. And Leah is able to have children. Look at Genesis 29, verse 31. We read, "Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." So who opened Leah's womb? Who allowed her to have children? God. Which means who is not allowing Rachel to have children? God. We're often guilty of what's called reductionism, that we reduce things down to something far too simplistic. How do we have children? Pretty easy. A man and a woman get together and you have a simple recipe. You have part A, you have part B, and the result is C. Piece of cake. We all learned this in biology at a fairly early age. You got books, you got pictures. It's just really not that complicated. If you take part A and you mix it with part B, you're going to get part C. That's often the way science reduces things down. Now, there's some pretty tragic things about reductionism. To say that A plus B equals C is to remove entirely from the mind that A is a father and a loving husband, and B is a mother and a loving wife, and that C is a precious child. C is not a collection of tissue nor a clump of cells. C is a child, a human being. And what's being made very clear through what we've read already is that God is the author of life. Life is not accidental. It was not in the beginning, for it was created from God, nor is it accidental today. Now, if we talk to folks who don't believe in God or who rebel against God, they'll tell you that life is accidental. You know, we go from the goo all the way to the zoo, right? That there's a bunch of molecules and gases and sludge, and then lightning strikes, and then there's a cell, and then it becomes four, and then it becomes a fish, and then the fish is like, I'm going to invest in beachfront property, so it crawls up out of the water, it evolves, and then eats grass, swings from trees, it goes to college, and here we are, right? So it started accidentally, and you can see then the natural conclusion or the natural progression, and so life is all accidental. I mean, you got A and B, and sometimes you get C. It just happens, and then evolution continues. Well, since life is accidental and without purpose, lightning strike and goo and sludge and poof, right? Then the same is true today. Life continues to be accidental and has no purpose, and thus has no intrinsic or inherent value. And that's how you get to a place where part C is some sort of tissue mass described in the same way as a cancer mass or tumor. And, if you're not into that, then you can have it removed just like you would a cancerous mass, all is well. Because life is accidental, it has no purpose, and thus has no value. But the Bible's very clearly teaching us that God is the author of life, that it's not just A and B, it's A and B and God granting the gift. That C is a child created in the image of God as the result of the gift of God. It's not just biology. It's what is from God and who is from the hand of God. This struggle that Sarah has to have children and all the pressures and all the no's that she gets, we do see revealed in that God's the one in charge of that, and it doesn't change until God says yes. The same is true for Rachel. The same is true for Elizabeth. We run into Rebecca. We run into the same thing in Luke chapter 1, verse 7, when we read that Elizabeth is barren, that Zacharias' wife Elizabeth is not able to have children, and they're past the age of childbearing. And like any other couple, I think it's a fair assumption that they've been asking God for this gift, and they've been told no. That's part of John's shock and struggle to believe, or I said John, that's part of Zacharias' struggle and shock when Gabriel comes and says you're going to have a son, and he's like, how's this even possible? And he gets struck mute until his son is born, whom he's told to name John, who we will meet and learn to understand as John the Baptist. Over and over and over, we see that God is the author of life. Flip over to the book of Psalms, the 139th Psalm, and consider how the scriptures here describe the unborn. A mere collection of cells, a mass of tissue, a problem to be dealt with. In the 139th Psalm, David writes in the 13th verse, he says, as he speaks of God, he says, "For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb." That God is not only the author of life, but he is the designer of life. That God designs us in our mother's womb. I remember, and I forget what it was called, we were studying biology in part A and part B, you end up with C, and they were talking about genetics and DNA and the fun stuff. Why do you have blue eyes if your mom has brown eyes and your dad has green eyes, and the little quad chart of the DNA and your dominant and recessive traits. And all that's good stuff. See, what science is the pursuit of understanding how God does something. Science is about how something works. Science cannot be about origins. Because if you talk about origins, you're having to go to what cannot be measured, cannot be tested, and there are no witnesses. That's not science. That's religion. That's faith. That's something different because it is unmeasurable, at least with a tape measure or a scale. So we're learning this chart about recessive traits and dominant traits, genes and things like that. That's all good. That's trying to learn how God does something. But God's the one who decides if you have brown eyes or not. I think it's always interesting when you see those anomalies, if that makes sense. You have mom and dad, and they look a certain way, have a certain build, a certain height, and so on. And then here's their children, like, oh, yep, you can't deny that. That's their son or their daughter, and you can see the commonalities. But every once in a while, there's some fun things that happen. You can have dark-headed, darker complected people, and there's a red-headed baby. You can have, I think the most interesting one is you can have a mom and dad that are average in height, and all of a sudden here's this child that's, really tall, and somebody says, where'd they get their height? Well, the grandfather's side, something or other. Sure, all the genetic information is there for all kinds of things. But what science taught me in biology is, okay, so here's the genes, and then here's your little chart, and here are the chances. See, that's where it goes wrong. No. It's not chances, it's choices. Because, here's all the possible DNA possibilities. Here's all the genetic possibilities. So what you are is a result of chance. No, what you are is a result of choice. God has all of these choices, and he says, I think it's time for a redhead. Let's shake this up a little bit. Let's get some bright and fiery spirits in here, and let's remind people to laugh and to wake up a little bit. Right? That's God's choice. So our genetics, from our eye color to our fingerprints to our souls, are created by God. The Bible says that we are formed in our mother's womb. Our inward parts are put together, and that's all the inward parts. We are a result of God. And so the difference is, if not, we're all an accident, doesn't matter, then we don't matter. But if we're of God, then we know who we are and why we matter. That's why he says the very next verse in verse 14, I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. We are astonishingly well made. We are incredibly well made. It is amazing how complicated and amazing and fantastic that we are in the body and our soul and what we can do and dream and speak and communicate and so on. We should be impressed. But it's been reduced. Reduction is reduced it down to, we don't need God because it's just a simple recipe. It's really not that complicated. And then what happens is you get this random mix of weird genes and poof, there you are. So, there you are. Boy, you talk about an empty and dismal option. We are not a result of chance. We are a result of choice, of God's choice. And walking through Sarah's story, Rebecca's story, Rachel's story, and Elizabeth's story reminds us of that. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 1 where we started. Here's a woman who's been asking God for something, and God has been saying no. Does God know what he's doing? 1. 2, does God love us? Because when Sarah and Abraham were struggling, Abraham was like, well, I guess it should be Eliezer. No. And then when they're like, well, okay, well then I guess it'll be Hagar. And that choice they make creates havoc and leads to a constant struggle and war the Israelites will have with the descendants of Ishmael continues to this day. Because in that moment, both Abraham and Sarah didn't trust God's no. They tried to force a yes out of a no. Tried to force a yes out of a slow. Didn't want to wait for the grow. Hannah is a different story. She has been asking God, and God's been saying no, and it's been provoking her. She's been provoked by others. She's weeping. She's struggling with bitterness. Often bitterness has to do with something about forgiveness, so the struggles between her and Peninnah that's been poking at her about all this, and because she's of no value, etc. In verse 19, after this prayer that was so intense that Eli the prophet thought maybe she was drunk or something, they got up early in the morning and they worshiped before the Lord and then returned to their house. So she prayed that way, went back to her husband, then they came and they worshiped. They worshiped on the heels of such an intense prayer, of such weeping, of such bitterness, of such pain. They worship anyway, which is, by definition, an act of trust. To truly worship is to bow down before God, to submit to God, to trust God. After worship, they go home. In verse 19, they have a normal marriage relationship. And then look at the last phrase of verse 19. And the Lord remembered her. And she conceives. Verse 20, she gives birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. What a long and difficult road. Why wouldn't God just bless her with that like most everybody else? And I mean, why do this to her? She could have no idea that what this puts in motion is that Samuel will be raised in the temple, more or less, and will be the next priest. That Eli's the current priest, and his sons are rotten to the core as you continue reading over the next couple of chapters. And Samuel becomes a powerful leader, and he leads the people of God, that his influence is over the lives of millions of people. Millions of people, the entire nation of Israel is led and shepherded closer to God through Samuel. Samuel wouldn't have been raised in the temple. He wouldn't have had that background. He wouldn't have been who he was if he hadn't have been born to Hannah, if he hadn't have been born after such a struggle. There's a reason why God didn't give Sarah children immediately, nor Rebekah, nor Rachel, nor Hannah, nor Elizabeth, or the other things that he might tell us no about. A no can be a hard no. We've talked about that with Moses in the Promised Land. But that no was turned into the big yes. The no in Hannah's case and the other women's case that we've talked about in their families, the no was actually a slow that was turned into grow. Are we willing to trust God when he says no? It's a difference in growing or not.
The ground began to shake. The stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever he is glorified. Forever he is lifted high. Forever he is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive.